As of recording, I'm about 150 hours into Tears of the Kingdom. I've completed the main story, found all the light roots and shrines, did most of the side quests, and I think I got most, if not all, of the armor sets. The only thing I skipped almost entirely is finding Korok seeds, because I'm not a masochist. With most of the game's core content in the rearview mirror, I'm finally ready to talk about lore. However, from what I've been able to gather, a significant amount of people are not quite done with the main story, and even purposely stalling the story progression because they aren't ready for the game to end just yet. It's something I can totally get behind. So I think it's in everyone's best interest if we start out small. As such, I've compiled 10 lore secrets and details which are more or less disconnected from the main story, like side content, references to past entries, or the lore behind a certain character, item, or location, things like that. Of course, I cannot talk about lore without avoiding spoilers altogether, so for your convenience, here's a list of notable things that will be featured in the video. If any of these aspects are too much of a spoiler for you at this moment, I recommend coming back later. So with that said, let's get into it. Let's kick things off with the biggest and, in my opinion, the most interesting piece of lore on the list: the true nature and possible origins of the Gibdo. Tears of the Kingdom puts a very different spin on the Gibdo compared to previous titles, where they are more or less just bandaged up corpses akin to the classic mummy from pop culture. While they do still have humanoid features, their design and behavior in Tears of the Kingdom also has characteristics of that of insects, like their vertical, pincer-like mouths, weird pulsating neck thing, and most notably the fact that some of them have wings reminiscent of that of a moth or butterfly.
They fly now? They fly now!
Sorry, I had to put that in. We learned that the Gibdo that wander above ground emerge from these giant mushroom-like structures, which the game's protagonists refer to as hives. These hives seem to be largely responsible for them gaining access to the surface from below ground, which is where they are most commonly found. Seeing as the Gibdo were not present in Breath of the Wild, we can assume that their most recent appearance is connected to Ganondorf's magic in some way. In particular, the emergence of Queen Gibdo. Yes, they actually have a queen in this game. In fact, Ganondorf flat out tells you that the bosses of Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons are his servants, who he allegedly created or resurrected to cause mayhem in Hyrule. In the case of Queen Gibdo, she is confirmed to be responsible for the massive sandstorm that envelops Gerudo Town, and during her boss fight she is also shown to be in control of the hives. Despite all of this, there are hints that the Gibdo are not only more than just insects and still have some connection to the undead, like in the older games, but also that they have possibly existed independently of Ganondorf's rise and influence. First is the fact that we can find fossilized hives inside caves. These hives look ancient. They have seemingly turned to stone and are no longer active, yet there are still some Gibdo in their vicinity, and who knows how long these have been down here. But by far the most compelling piece of evidence is a passage from an old legend described by a member of the Yiga. The Yiga have built bases all across Hyrule's depths, and in each and every one of them you'll find a notebook containing some information about their plans, research, and so on. The notebook in question tells the story of an ancient Gerudo treasure, which goes like this. Quote, "Under the side of the Arbiter, in the darkness of the subterranean depths, lies a great treasure. Whosoever seeks this treasure must overcome their fear, as they will be met by a vortex of the wrath of the executed." Unquote. So let's break this down real quick. The site of the Arbiter mentioned here is clearly referring to the Arbiter's Grounds, a location which has been the subject of many theories ever since the previous title. It's a reference to the 4th dungeon in Twilight Princess, a vast coliseum in the Gerudo Desert. Originally a place of worship for the Gerudo, it is told that when the Hylians seized control of the Arbiter's Grounds during the war with Ganondorf and his people, they turned it into a prison and execution site for Hyrule's most wanted. In fact, it's where the failed execution of Ganondorf himself took place in the story. While the Arbiter's Grounds we see here shares little to no resemblance to the one from Twilight Princess, making a connection between the two difficult to prove, Tears of the Kingdom shows that there is more to this place. More specifically, its connection to the depths. Right below the Arbiter's Grounds is a place called the Gerudo Underground Cemetery, and it's clear that the legend spoken of in the Yiga notebook is referring to this location. It is right below the site of the Arbiter and does indeed have a treasure hidden inside one of the tombs here. Moreover, the cemetery is absolutely crawling with Gibdo. Gibdo, which is most likely what the so-called Wrath of the Executed is referring to. Executed, of course, implies that the Gibdo are in fact undead in some way. The reanimated remains of former prisoners who were punished and killed for their crimes, most likely by the ancient Gerudo. While it may seem odd that they would take on the shape of an insect-like being, it's actually not uncommon in the Zelda series that the deceased take on all kinds of different forms after death, from harmless or vengeful spirits to physical monsters like stealth enemies, redads, and more. It all depends on how they died or why they were brought back. For example, if there's some sort of curse involved. There's another location in Tears of the Kingdom that reinforces the idea that the Gibdo were originally prisoners, who were perhaps killed a long time ago. An ancient Gerudo prison found inside a sinkhole near Gerudo Town. This location has clearly been abandoned for thousands of years, and yet we find Gibdo here inside prison cells. Prison cells which in some cases are sealed shut and have no way in or out. Who knows how long these have been down here, stuck inside their cells, unable to find peace. One final feature that's worth mentioning is that in a lot of cases, the Gibdo have arrows or various types of weapons sticking out of them, like swords and spears, even the ones down in the prison. In fact, some parts of the prison are littered with arrows, so could these be hints to the method of execution? Whatever the case may be, it's a solid reminder to always stay on the Gerudo's good side. Since we're on the topic of the deceased, very cheerful I know, here's a little nod to Breath of the Wild and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. In the previous game we found a pile of rocks atop Mount Hylia on the Great Plateau, and the name of the in-game model as well as creating a champion confirmed that this is the grave of the king. And I'm not talking about King Furry over here, but King Rome Bosphoramos Hyrule, the last king of Hyrule who was among the many casualties of the Calamity, and moves on to the afterlife in the true ending of the game. Before that he can even be seen visiting his own grave in spirit form. When revisiting the site in Tears of the Kingdom, we find a large two-handed sword stuck in the ground here. The sword is a royal claymore, which in Age of Calamity is the king's weapon of choice. It's a nice little callback, and while the game doesn't tell us who left the sword here, I'd like to think that it was Zelda. It would only make sense that she would have visited her father's grave after the events of the previous game, and subsequently left his favorite weapon here to honor his memory. Next we have something that's not so much a lore revelation, but instead just a neat little detail. The torch Link and Zelda are seen carrying during the opening segment and subsequently falls into the abyss alongside Zelda can actually be found in the game. I won't spoil the how, when and where, but you can in fact revisit this exact spot at some point. And when you do, you'll come across a lone torch laying at the very bottom of the chasm. Again, it doesn't have any massive lore implications, but I do think it's cool that they took the effort to include a small detail like this, especially considering that most people probably didn't even notice or remember the torch falling down since the focus is on Link and Zelda. When you sleep at one of the stables, you are given the choice between a regular bed or a Malenia bed. If you choose the latter, you'll not only wake up with extra hearts and stamina, but you also get a visit in your dreams from the horse god Malenia and receive telepathic messages from them. Malenia is, as their title suggests, a godlike entity who watches over the many horses that roam the kingdom, and even has the ability to bring them back from the afterlife. One of the messages you can receive from Malenia while lodging at the stables involves a new species of animal which weren't present in Breath of the Wild. The Dondons, which are awesome if only for the fact that it's my first name repeated twice. An NPC states that these creatures were discovered recently by none other than Princess Zelda herself, and that so far only 5 of them are known to exist. Funnily enough, Zelda is seen riding one of these animals in the 2019 footage, which was unfortunately scrapped for the finished game. Malenia reveals that the Dondons have not only existed since ancient times, but that they are in fact distant ancestors of the current day horses. If this is true, then I gotta say, evolution works in mysterious ways in Hyrule. Then again, this is the same series where fish people evolved into birds in just a few centuries, so nothing too surprising, I guess. Next is a detail that could give us a bit more insight into some of the history of the ancient Sheikah and their technology from 10,000 years ago. Those who are familiar with the last game will no doubt have noticed that most of the Sheikah tech seen in Breath of the Wild has all but disappeared, which unfortunately isn't really touched upon. It's just gone now with little to no explanation. So we have to assume that they got rid of it or repurposed it in some way in the years following the victory over Calamity Ganon, which not only includes the divine beasts, guardians, Sheikah towers and regular shrines, but even the iconic shrine Shrine of Resurrection, the starting point of the previous adventure where Link had been recovering from his near-death experience for close to a century. In the present day, all traces of the Shrine of Resurrection are gone. The floor, ceiling, and walls have been completely stripped, and it just looks like a natural cave at this point. The only thing that remains and calls back to the shrine's unique properties is a puddle of water which, when entered, slowly heals you. It's the same effect as the various hot springs found across Hyrule. In fact, the water inside the shrine seems to be warm as well, as evident from the steam and bubbles rising up. However, there's one major difference between the water inside the Resurrection Cave and the hot springs, which brings us to Hyrule's depths. In a video I made quite a long time ago, I argued that there might be volcanic activity below the Hebra Mountains, because despite being one of the coldest places in the game, there are multiple hot springs present here. The only other region in Breath of the Wild where we found hot springs was on Death Mountain, and of course here it made perfect sense given that it's a literal volcano. But how can a hot spring exist in a place with such a frigid climate, unless something is heating these waters up somehow? And lo and behold, Tears of the Kingdom confirms that this is indeed the case. In the depths right below every hot spring in Hebra is an active magma flow, which further emphasizes the relationship between the depths and the surface above. However, the same explanation cannot be applied to the Shrine of Resurrection. As far as we know, there's no heat source to create a hot spring here, but there is something else beneath the shrine that could explain the water's healing properties. As we saw previously with the Arbutus Grounds and the Gerudo Underground Cemetery, many noteworthy locations on the surface have something of interest in the depths right below them, and the same goes for the Shrine of Resurrection. In the vast expanse of Hyrule's underworld, there's a total of 4 similar locations known as well springs, 3 of which correspond to the springs of power, wisdom, and courage found on the surface. However, a 4th one exists right below where the Shrine of Resurrection used to be, and is called the Wellspring of Revival. The water inside these subterranean springs have the same healing effect as the hot springs, including the small puddle inside the Resurrection Cave. Now, it's made obvious that the structures found in the underworld predate the events from 10,000 years ago by a pretty wide margin. After all, they fit the architectural style of the Zonai, and the Zonai existed long before Ganondorf even entered the scene, let alone Calamity Ganon. This could mean that the ancient Sheikah, despite never mentioning it in Breath of the Wild, either knew about the existence of the depths, or at the very least were aware that certain spots around Hyrule had unique properties. Thus, the location of the Shrine of Resurrection's construction was not just a random choice, but because there was already something here that piqued their interest, and would serve as the basis for this medical facility. They may have discovered that the water here has special healing effects, something they were able to tap into and amplify with their technology to restore even the most severe injuries. Since we're on the topic of the depths, we might as well linger here for a bit longer and cover some other details about it. So here's a few interesting accounts from the Yiga about their experiences and observations inside the underworld. It comes to light that the Yiga's interactions with the supernatural elements of the depths differ quite a bit from Link's experiences. For example, they are unable to approach Poes, let alone collect them like Link does. One member describes that they do witness strange ethereal lights, but that when they try to get closer, the lights disappear. It makes them question if they are perhaps just another species of firefly, which are abundant down here. Why the Poes disappear when the Yiga try to approach is not explained, but it could have something to do with their evil nature or purity of their hearts in some way. Ever since Breath of the Wild, it's been made clear that different people will have different experiences with beings who are classified as spirits. For example, Link and kids who are of a certain age can see the dragons, whereas most adults are completely oblivious to them. Same goes for the spirits of the forest, who can also only be seen by specific individuals. And thank God, because the stuff we are doing to these poor creatures is not for the faint of heart. The Yiga also briefly elaborate on the ghostly shadows seen atop these rock piles, or rather the lack thereof, because it becomes apparent that the Yiga cannot actually see these shadowy figures, and instead all they see is a weapon floating in midair. There's a lot to discuss and theorize about these shadow ghosts in the future, but for now, it's interesting to know that these figures don't actually make themselves known to everyone. Another account from one of the clan members shares an eerie detail about the bargainer statues. The entities who inhabit these statues explain that they help lost souls find their way into the afterlife. They will trade all sorts of items and armor sets in exchange for Poe spirits Link has collected in the underworld. In that sense, they seem friendly. However, one Yiga soldier paints a more sinister picture of the bargaining statues. They claim that when some of their fellow clan members got close, they had their souls stolen from them, which from what I understand means that they were essentially killed by the statue. But how and why is a mystery. It's quite a fascinating revelation because the statues themselves emphasize that when they help lost souls, they make no distinction between good or evil, as this is a quote futile perspective of narrow-minded beings. But I guess they don't pass the same judgment on the living, and will steal your soul if you're not worthy of an audience with them. It's a good thing Link is the chosen one, or else his quest to save the world would have been cut short unexpectedly. So you may have noticed that some of the monsters inside the depths are mining for zonaite. This precious resource, which is predominantly found in Hyrule's depths, can be processed into various types of energy cells that fuel the zonaite technology. As such, the Yiga, who have a vested interest in the zonaite tech, are also scouring the underworld for zonaite. At first it may seem like the monsters and the Yiga are working towards the same goal. After all, they are both on the side of the Demon King. But this doesn't appear to be the case, as one of their notebooks states, quote, "It appears that some of the monsters in the area have been mining for ore particular to the depths. Our fellow Yiga have found them working in large numbers around mineral deposits, and even carrying these ores. But why? Could the ore have some special use?" Unquote. There's also various accounts of the Yiga actively trying to avoid monsters, so they are definitely not on friendly terms despite being on the same side. It appears that the monsters are operating independently of the Yiga, and it makes you wonder why they would be interested in these minerals to begin with. After all, monsters don't utilize zonaite technology like the Yiga do, so there must be something else motivating them to mine for zonaite. Which brings us to the last observation by the Yiga for this video. They mentioned that the monsters in the depths are different from the ones in the surface in that they never seem to sleep. Of course, there's no sunlight down here and thus no perception of night and day, but I would imagine that even monsters need some shut-eye once in a while. But apparently not down here, which probably has something to do with the fact that, with the exception of the frogs, who seem to be native to this environment, all monsters in the depths are infected with malice. Or gloom, I should say. Seriously, why they changed the name? It's so confusing. Anyway, the gloom seems to give monsters the ability to go on forever without ever getting tired, which on its own is already quite interesting since gloom has the opposite effect on humans. It saps their life force, making them feel sick and drained of energy. We've seen in Breath of the Wild that malice is not only harmful to the touch, but that it can also act as a kind of fuel, as seen with the Guardians. My running theory is that the monsters inside the depths are mining zonaite in service of Ganondorf, more specifically to aid in his revival. The game makes it clear that Ganondorf is gathering his strength, so he can be restored to his former self. And since zonaite can act as a power source when processed, it's possible that his monster squad is gathering energy to help speed up his restoration, fueled by his gloom and never stopping to take a break. And since we're on the topic of Ganondorf, there's a stone monument inside the previously unseen basement of Hyrule Castle that explains why the castle was built there in the first place. It states that its initial construction is closely tied to upholding the seal on the Demon King, to make sure that nobody would disturb his underground tomb and release him from his chains, be it on purpose or accidentally, which as we all know still ends up happening eventually and I guess was bound to happen at some point. Either way, I find it interesting that back when the castle was built, its primary function was not to display the Hylian's power and dominance, or because it was a strategic location to put it, but to essentially serve as a sort of cork, sealing off the underworld and keeping Ganondorf's existence hidden. If not for Ganondorf, the castle may have been constructed somewhere completely different, maybe on the Great Plateau. For the final piece of lore, we're going back to the surface, to the original Zonai ruins, the OG location that started the whole Zonai craze long before we knew anything about the sequel to Breath of the Wild and its story. For the sake of spoilers, I won't say which part of the story this takes place in or what the goal is, but at some point we're supposed to visit the Zonai ruins to help solve a mystery. However, before you do, one of the researchers investigating the history of the Zonai, called Caleb, shares a pretty big bombshell with us back at Kakariko Village. He states that the Zonai ruins situated in Farron actually predate the ruins that fell from the sky. I won't go too deep into the implications here, because that's a topic that can easily take up a video of its own, but safe to say, this is a pretty big revelation. It's implied that at least some of the ruins we find in the sky are part of the original Zonai civilization, the ones who first descended onto Hyrule long before Rauru, before Ganondorf, before any of the events we see happening in the past. For example, a construct on Bravery Island tells the story of how young Zonai warriors used to partake in skydiving contests here as part of their transition into adulthood, meaning this island existed back when the Zonai were still plentiful. By the time Zelda arrives in the ancient past, it's told that the Zonai have already left the surface a long time ago. Castle. Everyone except Rauru and his sister. They are the last of the Zonai at this point in time, or at least the last ones who reside on the surface. The idea that the ruins in Farron are even older than the ones found in the sky has so much potential for theories and speculation, because by all accounts it could mean that they were built before the Zonai ever even set foot in Hyrule, and thus may not even be of Zonai making, but rather built by a different faction who lived on the surface before the Zonai's arrival. It would explain why some of the quote-unquote Zonai architecture on the surface is so different from the ones found in the sky and in Hyrule's underworld. Aside from the dragon motif, it's not even close when you really put these two side by side. I intend to make a future video on this topic, so for now I will leave it at that so I can work it out into something bigger. I'd like to say thank you all so much for watching, and it's good to be back making Zelda videos again. My apologies if my voice sounded a bit different. I'm coming down with the worst case of hay fever I've had in a long time, so yeah. Anyway, I hope you continue to have a good time with the game. I know I will, and I will see you all next time.